I'm going to quickly give an overview of how I got here. So I've been a landscape architect for 20 years, and over the last few years, maybe around 5 to 7 years, I started getting a little disturbed seeing the same planting happening anywhere. You know, whether you were in Delhi or I practiced in Bangalore for a few years, or whether I went to a Delhi nursery or a Bangalore nursery, and this kind of homogenization of the plants was something which obviously is our responsibility as landscape architects, but it started bothering me even more when I realized that historic sites, which ought to have been repositories of showcasing a language of a time, a certain palette, a certain romance associated with the plants, also showcase the same issue. And at that point I realized, look, if someone with a background in landscape and heritage is not going to address it, then we should not be leaving this to a horticulturist, because his or her domain would be different, a conservation architect's domain would be different, and a landscape architect's need and understanding would be completely different. So I kind of fell into this more out of a sense of duty rather than this being my forte as such, and I felt that, okay, I need to really do something about it. And though I kind of went on this crusade of wanting to do something about it, I think at the end of the year I realized how little I know about what I was working on for 20 years. So another thing which prodded this whole application into for the INTACH scholarship was the fact that there were too many projects now in the market and too many coming up soon in the near future. And I realized if we don't address planting for historic precincts now, all of us, including all the colleagues, architects and conservation architects, are going to keep doing the same sort of wash over the sites, and it's just going to get worse. Whatever's left is also going to go away. So one of the concerns also was that though discussions around planting are gaining momentum, it's primarily through individual, maybe a very few institutional efforts. They address use and availability of indigenous species, sustenance of biodiversity, and hence the focus is really ecological. So when I started this exercise, there was this turmoil that, we're talking about indigenous and use indigenous, but historic planting is not really only about indigenous. It is about the plants which were used at a site, which may have been gifts from Spain or the Americas or something, so they weren't necessarily indigenous. And that was a first distinction I had to be very sort of careful about when I set out to do this. So this effort of it being ecological and not addressing the cultural issues became a top concern. And of course then something that probably one did out of habit of doing multiple projects or writing or whatever, or teaching in the studio or something, one realized that there was a need for a process of research, but also how this research fed into execution of planting on a historic site. So where I felt I wanted to put my heart in was also the fact that how do you ensure that this planting gets done on a particular site? How does it get looked after? How does it mature? What are the problems in replacement or finding the plants and all of that? So a brief research aim was to prepare guidelines for undertaking planting at historic precincts as a scientific exercise that contributes to their historic value. And for me, it was very important to get this message across, especially to my conservation colleagues, the urban planning colleagues, which is that when you do appropriate planting, which is based on scientific research, it actually adds to the historic value. It is imperative to do it, which is my understanding, but other people don't find that imperative. But if you do it in the right way, it's actually adding to the historicity of the site. So it's not an option really, it's part of the process. I had a long presentation in December, so in this presentation I'm only focusing on the 10 set of guidelines that we came up with, and I'm only touching upon them. So they're all listed here. I'll just take you through each one of them over a minute each probably. In the introduction, we started questioning whom are the guidelines meant for, how should the guidelines be read, context in which the guidelines must be employed. So they're not necessarily only for, historic projects. There could be new interventions in historic areas, etc. And here I got a very good feedback from the peer reviewer where he said, I'd used words such as landscape archaeologist and landscape historian, and, my peer reviewer, Nikhil Dhar, who's a landscape architect, and he came and said, let's plug this into reality. Because in India, we don't find all these genres of expertise. And if you're going to ask people to follow it, it's not going to happen. So do we do some set of guidelines which are the basic that at least need to be followed, and some which are the ideal, that, okay, when these professions take off or we call experts from elsewhere, then we can sort of use their expertise on it. The next part of the guidelines, of course, the guidelines themselves are a document, so I'm not going to touch upon it, but I'm just, the things that I've thought this room might be interested in. So in the first section, or the second section on research and documentation, decision-making regarding planting at historic precincts should be informed by thorough background research and documentation related to plant palette, the layout, and its contribution to the overall ambience. So this is just an image of Pinjore as shown by Villiers Stewart and as it was today. But here one of the concerns which, I'm sorry it's not very clear here, is that conclusions from research may not assist in gauging the appearance of plants in terms of composition or scale in the absence of an in-depth understanding of the philosophy of aesthetics which may have existed then. So it's not a very straightforward thing that you see an art piece or you see something which was of the garden or the landscape and you just sort of start following that through. The sources need to be cross-referenced with each other as they may individually not hold authentic information. With the exception of photographic material, care must be taken in the interpretation of illustrations. They may show proposals for landscape which may never have been executed, or may have included fictitious additions to enhance the illustration as a work of art. Meaning that, it may just have been someone's fancy putting this across rather than something that was actually there. So we have to be careful of that. And then saying that an illustration may require corroboration from written evidence of documentation, letters, etc., so that one could actually interpret how the landscape may have been at a particular date. Indicating that while you take up research and documentation, and I've mentioned where to go to, what to look at, what to be careful about, whatever I could sort of garner, and I'm sure it's just the starting of these guidelines, but meaning that we have to be very careful in where we look for information and then what we get, how we interpret it. Again, in terms of secondary studies, like I said, looking at maps, illustrations, tapping into living memory. I mean, on one of our documentation projects for INTACH, we actually found something because there was one guy who was just roaming around the site and we weren't getting to anything, and he just pointed out saying, "Yahan kyariyan thi, aur char ped the, khirni ke." And then when I started sketching things out for him, and he said, "Haan, aisa hi tha jo mujhe bachpan se yaad hai." So, these are also important things to document and also to present our research from time to time so that, we can keep a check on whether it's going in the right direction. This was quite challenging, planting aesthetics. So an understanding of how planting was undertaken at site in different periods requires a well-researched analysis of the progression of the aesthetic character of the softscape. Now here we know how our landscape has changed, how it was. Any landscape, it's the first thing that can sort of, because of the ephemerality, it can be erased. Now whether it was something at a particular period in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, and then the colonial intervention, then the post independence, D-Day intervention or something. So we have to be very careful of what period we are looking at and then analyze the aesthetics from within that perspective. So here we've said, to assess the character defining elements of planting and their contribution to the heritage value of the historic precinct, to analyze the existing character of the space and surroundings, using primary and secondary sources to analyze aesthetics to the study of the philosophy of planting design. Today we do very ornamental and very particular clusters. There's some that do very mixed clusters. The English garden was a completely different bedding system. So each of these has some relevance which, we need to look at. Experience of the spirit of the place. So it's just not about getting the layout and the plants right. It is when you do something and you enter that space, you know, for anyone, even a visitor today, for him to feel something about that space which is evocative of what it may have been, is actually extremely important. Then looking at the planting design layout, the visual analysis, the plant palette. This was really something which I think which took maximum time of my research, authenticity in planting. And it has opened up all sorts of things in my brain, you know, where are you looking at the planting? So planting proposals for historic precincts must be based on sufficient documentary, oral, fabric, archaeological evidence that guide, I'm using the word reconstruction, but it's not really, you know, it could be replanting or just the interpretation. When this is not possible, in place of replanting, the site should be considered for sympathetic interpretation. So we don't always have to go and do the wrong thing and plant the wrong thing. It can be left as such. You know, we already have a water problem. Every site does not need to have lawn and planting and hibiscus, and you leave it as such, put up signages which show what it may have been, and let the research go on till you come to a comfortable point and you can decide that, okay, this is what we would like to do. So authenticity, I've listed out some of the, you know, factors which contribute to this. One aspect which has been plaguing me for a long time is availability of planting and the loss of our plants, you know, our plant systems. And I find every nursery from Bangalore to Calcutta to Kadiyam to everywhere has the same plants. And one of the reasons of taking up this research was to actually tie up with nurseries to say, guys, there's money now in the future to look at all your indigenous planting, you know, all your older strains and all of that. So that's something that I've also looked at a little bit and advised on. Looking at the right team of people. Of course, on-site execution, we are a hardcore landscape architecture design practice, looking at how planting plans are made, what they need to indicate, how, you know, and all of that. Getting our CAD and all our representation right also was very important to us. This is one of my most favorite, which is telling stories through our landscape, and how you can talk about how you can talk about your landscapes and your planting in your signages, making it mandatory for every signage of INTACH to have a little corner which we talk about planting layouts, we talk about pallets, we talk about, you know, all of that component, instead of just sort of writing over it. Maintenance, again, you know, you all know that you don't maintain a garden for a month and it's gone. So you can spend as much money on it. It doesn't matter. It's going to be down to nothing in maybe less than a month even. So this in any landscape, and now the visionary clients are actually in the beginning of presentations asking, what is the maintenance cost? You know, I want to know that right straight out. So I think this, from a historic planting perspective, needs to be considered right in the beginning. Monitoring, something which is very important because it needs to firstly be built into the project. It's very important because of the ephemerality of the plant. So you go back and you come thinking that, oh my God, you know, what did I plant? I spent so much money, so much research, and when I go back to visit the site, it looks like this. I mean, this is not what we had planted, but I'm just saying any site just lands up looking like this. So I'm just going to end here. I want to thank everyone, and I really want to thank INTACH for helping me sort of explore this a little further, which I probably wouldn't have done in the regular, you know, work life.